Good evening, everyone, and welcome to all of you who have come to join us for what's going to be a fascinating evening. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I just want to point out that our guest speaker tonight is not what you get every day, and it's definitely not what you get in Bournemouth every day. Very rarely do we have the honor to have someone of this caliber come and speak for us in Bournemouth, although we always try to get top speakers, but this is really something very special, and we're really, truly honored and privileged. Our speaker tonight is an ordained rabbi, he's an ethicist, he's a neurologist, he's the chairman of the Medical Ethics Unit at Shaare Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem, and if I stand here and list off all of his achievements tonight, then they'll take the whole night and you won't be able to hear him. So I will just point out a few things. Rabbi Steinberg authored a 7-volume encyclopedia of Jewish medical ethics. This work has been translated in English, and for this work he was awarded with the Israel Prize, which is the highest prize that Israel gives for people who give contributions in their fields to society. In the 1980s, when Israel was looking into performing heart transplants, human heart transplants, the health ministry and the leading hospitals in Israel turned to the rabbinate to ask the chief rabbinate what would be the halachic ramifications and the ethical ramifications of a heart transplant. And the chief rabbinate turned to a group of leading expert doctors and rabbis, and leading the team was our guest speaker, Rabbi Avraham Steinberg, and who led a team of research to look into the halachic issues and the ethical issues surrounding a heart transplant. And a result of that committee, there was a landmark halachic ruling issued by the chief rabbinate of Israel, which is followed till today. Rabbi Steinberg has also authored dozens, maybe hundreds of scholarly articles which are available online, and anyone can go and search them and read them all the time. On a personal note, it's a great privilege for me to be able to thank him personally, because I have personally gained from his writings, both his printed writings and his writings online, very much. And if anyone's interested in this topic, there's just so much that he has given to it. So, really, I can go on, but you didn't come to hear me, and it's really my great honor and privilege to introduce our guest speaker, Rabbi Professor Avraham Steinberg.
Thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be here for my first time in Bournemouth. I travel quite a lot, but here I have something new to tell my children. I visited Bournemouth, and thank you for coming and listening. The topic that we'll discuss in the next half an hour or so is related to the very new advancements in genetics. Genetics has become the leading science in medicine that daily introduces new things. Just now that we are talking, some new discovery has occurred, a new gene was discovered to explain a certain disease, and it's going on and on in a very fast manner. But the advancements also create ethical and halachic questions, and not everything that we know how to do, we really should do. Sometimes things that we know how to do may lead to side effects or to other aspects of it which we don't want them to be, and therefore we need to understand what it is, what the purpose is, how science works it, and what are the questions that we should ask. So I'll divide my talk into 3 major issues in genetics. Obviously there are many, but just to give you a taste of the issue. So since I assume that most of you, or maybe all of you, are not geneticists, are not people in the medical field, let me just give you a brief introduction of what we know about genetics today. So as you know, we are composed of 46 chromosomes that include about 25,000 genes, which build the body that we are composed of, builds the proteins, which is the foundation of what we are, physically at least. Mentally, it's questionable, but at least physically, that is the situation, and that is controlled by those genes. Now, those genes were identified just a few years ago by the Human Genome Project that was done in the United States with the collaboration from scientists from all over the world, and soon from England, from Israel, and from other places. The previous assumption was that we have around 100,000 genes because, for instance, the little fly that sometimes bothers you is composed of 13,000 genes. So the assumption was if the little fly who is nothing in the world has 13,000, how many more do we have to have in order to be human beings? And surprisingly, it turned out that we only have 25,000 genes, so we're not so far from the fly with the number. What else is amazing is that 99% of the genes that we have are identical. The differences that you look around here and you see that no one is the same as the one that he sits next to is based on 1% of difference. That makes the whole difference from so many human beings, and there are no two people who are identical except for identical twins. Other than that, even non-identical twins, brothers, sisters, children, and certainly people who are alien from a genealogical point of view, are very, very different and unique, all based on 1% of difference. So that's really mind-boggling to understand where we are at now and how we thought we knew just a few years ago. I'm mentioning this because this is the basis for certain advancements of genetics that we are using today, which have some halachic questions whether and how to use it. So the first issue, I want to discuss identification. Identification of human beings based on the DNA difference between human beings. It is supposed, although no one can prove it, that there are probably less than 1 in 30 million people who may have the same DNA. So really, everyone, practically speaking, has a different DNA. So for instance, in Israel, we unfortunately encounter terrorist attacks, and sometimes several people are killed by a bomb. They are dismantled. There's an arm here, and a leg there, and a part of a body there. But we want to bury the person as one person. We don't want to bury a body with a hand that belongs to someone else. But how can we know it when we see them in the street so spread out? So by DNA, we can identify who belongs to whom, what part belongs to whom. And realizing that this arm has the same DNA as this body, we can bring to burial the entire body of this unique person, which is a very important halachic concept, to bury every part of the body in its entirety, whatever is obviously available. But we look for it, and even blood that spills out, we collect, we test the DNA, and we bury the blood with the body that it belongs to. So that is a very positive aspect for a halachic purpose. It wasn't invented, the DNA wasn't invented to identify such parts, but that is a product that we use, unfortunately, quite frequently. There's another issue of identification. Let's say a couple gets divorced, and they have children. So by Jewish law, and I assume by other legal systems, the father of the child has to pay alimony to his children when the couple gets divorced, right? So here comes the husband of the wife and says, I don't want to pay for this child because it's not my child. You had an affair, this is a child from someone else, I'm not his father, so I don't have to pay. So how do you identify fatherhood in such a dispute? Nowadays, very easy. You take the DNA of the child, you take the DNA of the mother, you take the DNA of the father, and you can identify positively 100% whether this child belongs to this man or not. If he belongs to him, he has to pay. And if he doesn't belong to him, he's exempt. It's not his child. That, however, creates a very significant issue, which is called mamzerim. Because if this child turns out not to be the child of the husband, so he is the child of another man who had an affair with a married woman. And if she had an affair not with her husband while being married, the child is a mamzer. And a mamzer means that he cannot marry ever anyone. Because a mamzer cannot marry any other person, whether it's a female or male, doesn't matter, but he can't marry. So by doing the test to identify who the father is, for monetary purposes, we run into a problem which is a consequence of this test, which creates a tremendous tragedy to this child, if it's found to be that he is not his father. That's a big issue. The bottom line is that we don't accept the DNA testing to the degree that it will make the child a mamzer, although scientifically it doesn't make sense. But halachically, there are rules that we can invoke in this situation which will exempt this child from being a mamzer, but yet the father will not pay the money. And this halachic exercise is a little bit too complicated to explain here, but this is the bottom line of how we rule today. Another issue of identification is a current story that is just evolving now, which started 60 years ago when the Yemenite Jews came to Israel. They came from Yemen, and they jumped from the 15th century into the 20th century by one flight that they took. And they were regarded as primitive people that don't understand anything, don't know anything. And what happened then was that if a child became sick, got a pneumonia or any kind of a cold or whatever, was taken to the hospital. After a day or two, the parents were notified that the child died, and he was buried. And there was no body, there was no death certificate. They just told the parent, you brought the child, unfortunately he died. It wasn't one, it wasn't two, there were hundreds of children that were diagnosed, that were told to the parents that they died and were buried. And the parents never saw the child, the body, or whatever the story is. The parents suspected that these children were taken for adoption because it was right after the Shoah. There were couples who couldn't have children and they wanted to raise children, so they told these primitive parents, what can they give to their children? Better for us to take them, raise them, and they'll get better life than they could give. That was the assumption. That happened in the 50s. There were subsequently many investigations into it, and no definite conclusion was drawn whether they really died and buried or they disappeared, probably for adoption. Now with DNA, if we open the grave of the supposed buried children of the Yemenite families, we can take a little sample from the bone that is left in the grave, test the DNA and compare it to the sequence of supposedly this child. If it will be found identical, then indeed the child died, and this is the sibling of the people who are by now his brothers or sisters are 60, 70 years old, but they are this family. If it's not found identical, then the whole story was a fake story, and people will look into it. And just recently, 2 weeks ago, the Knesset in Israel enacted a legislation to allow to open the graves and to test for DNA. That came after a discussion in the chief rabbinate of Israel whether it's permissible. Because by Jewish law, you're not allowed to open a grave, and you're not allowed to move the bones that are left in the grave to other places, because you have to take them into the lab. There's a central lab that does DNA on bones, and then they can bring it back for burial, but the process of bringing them back and forth is very problematic. We have written a whole responsum on that, and we came to a conclusion that for this purpose it would be permissible. And only after the chief rabbinate allowed it, the legislation was passed. So that is again a situation where halachically it's not so clear, but after discussion it was allowed. I'm sure there would be, or maybe there are by now, rabbis who would disagree with this ruling and say you can't do it. We always are in dispute. There's nothing that everyone agrees, certainly not the Jews. But that was the ruling, the current ruling just a few weeks ago by the chief rabbinate of Israel. So that again, using DNA to try to solve a historic question. Based on the fact that we can do this testing, obviously with qualifications, it has to be made sure that everything comes back for burial. There are a lot of problems how to do it scientifically. I won't go into the details, but assuming that we can solve those problems from a scientific point of view, it is permissible. So that is another way of identification. And again, a very recent discovery, there is such a thing as a Jewish gene. A Jewish gene means that there is some mutation. Mutation means a change in one of the genes that doesn't affect anything. It doesn't cause a disease, or it doesn't cause any change of character, but there is a change. And some changes are unique to Jews. And the question is, if you find this gene on a person who claims that he is Jewish, but doesn't have other proof that he is Jewish, can you rely on this gene mutation to say that he is Jewish? That is particularly important for Russian Jewry, that after 70 years of communism, they claim that they are Jewish, but they can't bring any proof. They don't have any documents, they don't have any witnesses. Everything was destroyed during the communist era. How can we know whether they are Jewish or not? So sometimes we really don't know, and they have to undergo conversion, even though they claim that they know that they are Jewish, but they have no proof. But if we find this Jewish gene to be valid, halachically and scientifically, then we have a test to prove whether he's Jewish or not. And what is this Jewish gene? So again, in order to understand it, let me briefly give you another scientific detail. Every cell in the body has a nucleus which contains most of the genes. Over 99% of the genes are included in the nucleus. And they are small organelles in the cell that are called mitochondria. And the task of the mitochondria is to supply the energy to the cell to do its job. It needs energy to work. So the mitochondria supply the energy. There are 27 genes in those mitochondria that are totally separated from the 25,000 genes that are in the nucleus. Now it so happens that the egg of the female is one of the biggest cells in the body, and therefore it has many mitochondria. Whereas the sperm is one of the tiniest cells in the body, and it has very few mitochondria. But even more amazing is that once the sperm and the egg unite, there's a mechanism that destroys the few mitochondria that came from the sperm. So that once we have a fertilized egg, and that develops into an embryo and then into a human being, all the mitochondria that we have comes from our mothers. Nothing comes from the father. Now for Jewishness, it is very important because, as you know, Jewishness is determined only by the mother. The father doesn't have any role in many things, but at least as far as Jewishness, he has no role at all. So it's amazing that the mitochondria, the entire number of mitochondria in all of our cells, comes only from our mother. Now, if there is a mutation in this mitochondria, we know that this mutation came from our mother. And if we know that the mother was Jewish, then we are Jewish, right? So a study showed that about 40% of Ashkenazi Jews have a mutation in their mitochondria that doesn't exist in non-Jewish people around them, in all parts of the world. Wherever there are Jews and non-Jews, if they're Ashkenazi, they have a certain mutation, that this mutation isn't found in non-Jewish people. Now, how do we know that the ones that we tested are Jews? Maybe they are not Jews, and still they have this. So in order for them to enter the test and qualify as Jews, there was an investigation done on 4 generations up to prove that all the mothers from both sides were Jewish, by witnesses and by documents. So we know that this particular individual that we are now testing his mitochondria is 100% a Jew from both sides of his parents, 4 generations. And only those were taken to be tested. And then there were taken non-Jews that claim to be non-Jews. And it was found that only in those who are Jewish this mutation appeared, and none of the non-Jews had this mutation. So now the question is, if we don't know about, someone comes and says, I'm Jewish, and he has no proof, and we take from his sputum or from his blood or from whatever, it doesn't matter, we take a sample and we test the mitochondria, and we find the Jewish mutation that we already identified. Is it Jewish by that or not? There is now an ongoing debate amongst the Dayanim, the Rabbonim in Israel. My personal view is that that is a sign that they are Jews, and we can use it, because in Jewish law, unique signs have a great importance, at least in 2 aspects discussed in the Talmud. Again, I won't go into all the Talmudic debate, but just to give you an idea. If someone loses an object, he lost a bill of 20 sterling, and he goes away, and he comes back, and it disappeared. And someone finds it. The one that found it doesn't have to return it to anyone, because how would he know who it belongs to? Why doesn't he know who it belongs to? Because the same bill is similar to any hundreds of such bills, and how can you say that you lost it? Maybe someone else lost it. So if it doesn't have a unique sign, it belongs to the finder. However, if someone lost a purse with a very special way of tying the purse, that it's unique, no one is tying that way, and he lost it, and someone finds it, because he sees a unique sign, by Jewish law, he has to announce that he found something, he found a purse. Whoever can give me the unique sign, I know it belongs to him, and I'll return it to him. And the person who lost it, that knows that he knows this is his sign, and he comes forward and says, gives the details of the sign, by Jewish law you must return it to him. Why? Because the sign is evidence. It is evidence that it belongs to the one that lost it. On a different aspect, has to do with the concept of aguna. Aguna is a woman, a married woman, that her husband disappeared. And we don't know if he is alive or dead. As long as we don't know whether he died or not, she cannot remarry, because she is a married woman that wasn't freed from her husband, neither by divorce nor by death. And as long as we don't know that he died, she is stuck. And it can take years, or maybe forever, that no one will find any signs that this person died. But let's say a body of a male is found somewhere, and the woman claims, this is my husband. We will believe her only if she can give a sign that is unique to whoever was her husband. Let's say he had a big lump on his nose. So, most people don't have such a lump. This person was found with such a big lump. She claims that her husband had it. Today you can look at pictures and you can really identify. So by this sign, this is evidence that this person who is dead now was her husband. Okay? So now a real story. In the Twin Tower catastrophe, there was a woman, a Jewish woman living in New York, that claimed that her husband was in one of the Twin Towers and he died. But we didn't know whether he was there, maybe he went somewhere else. He didn't come to work, and she thought he went to work, and he's living now a good life somewhere else, who knows? There was a shoulder found within the ruins of the Twin Towers. A DNA was taken from this shoulder, compared to the hair on the brush at home of the husband of this wife, and it was found identical. The same DNA on the hair at home was the DNA of the shoulder. Is it a proof that this is a husband who is dead? So again, we're coming to this question. Is it a sign that halachically is valid to be evidence that this person is dead? Now, for a sign to be evidence, it has to be unique. But how do you define uniqueness? How unique does it have to be? I won't again go into, it's a big discussion how you do it, but roughly most agree that it has to be in a frequency of less than 1 in 1,000. If you don't find a lump of a nose of a male in 1 of 1,000 males, then this is a unique sign belonging to the husband. As we said before, DNA is so unique that it's not found even 1 in 30 million, not to say 1 in 1,000. So again, my understanding is that this DNA is a proof, halachically proof, that this indeed is the person that was the husband of this wife, and she can remarry. So that is a major advantage of understanding what DNA can do as a sign to release a woman from being aguna all her life, and she can remarry. Now again, not everyone agreed to it, as usually, and there are some who disagree. In this particular case, all agreed to free the woman because it wasn't only the DNA, but there was, halachically it's called raglaim ladavar, something that is supportive of it. And what was the supportive issue here? This man called his wife and said, something is going on here in the Twin Towers, I don't know what's happening, and they lost touch. So that means that he was in the Twin Towers. And now we find a shoulder that belongs to him. So to assume that he ran away from the building that was collapsing, lost his shoulder, and he's still alive somewhere, obviously doesn't make any sense. So based on this combination, all rabbis agreed that this woman could remarry. So again, this is something that a sign, a DNA, is very helpful for halachic decision making. So there are many other such examples that we can use science, understanding what science is, understanding the limitations and the non-limitations of science, and using it for halachic purposes. So that is identification. Now let me turn to prevention. That's another big topic. The genetic is very helpful. And what are we talking about? If a couple that wants children wants to be sure that the child born will be healthy genetically, won't carry a serious genetic disease. Up to recently, what could this couple do? They could be, the wife could become pregnant, will test her pregnancy by amniocentesis or villi sampling or whatever, take samples of the fetus, test for a genetic disease that is prevalent in this particular family, let's say Tay-Sachs or Down syndrome or cystic fibrosis or whatever disease you can think of. There are about 5,000 identifiable genetic diseases. And in this particular family, we know that there is a carrier state of Tay-Sachs. And this couple wants to make sure that the fetus will not be born with Tay-Sachs, which is a terrible disease. So they take a sample from the pregnancy, they find that indeed the fetus has Tay-Sachs. How can we prevent the child from being born with Tay-Sachs? The only way is to abort, right? Because if he will be born with a disease. Now, abortion, without going into it at all, is a very complicated matter by Jewish law, and it's not a simple matter to perform an abortion. And sometimes, indeed, it's not allowed to abort, and a child with a defective disease, genetic disease, is born. Today, we can use another technology which was accepted halachically as permissible to prevent the birth of a sick child. And that is called PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. I don't know if you heard about it, but let me briefly explain to you what it is. What we do in this technique, we do an IVF procedure, an in vitro fertilization procedure, which means we get many eggs from the woman by stimulating. You know, a woman has only one egg per month. That won't be enough. So in order for her to produce more eggs, we stimulate with the hormones, and she produces, let's say, 15 eggs. We take all those eggs out. We fertilize all of them with the sperm of the husband in the lab, not in a body. And we get now 15 fertilized eggs. We let it divide twice, and we get each fertilized egg, we get 4 cells. Now, we take out 1 cell out of the 4. We test in this 1 cell whether it includes the gene for Tay-Sachs or not. If it includes the gene, then if we will implant the remaining parts of the fertilized egg, the child will be born 100% with Tay-Sachs. If this single cell doesn't have the DNA for Tay-Sachs, we can implant this remaining parts of the fertilized egg and assure the family that 100% the child will not have Tay-Sachs. Now what we can't assure the family is that it will be a perfect child, which everyone wants. That we can't do. But what we can do is identify the genetic disease of this particular couple, and as I said, about 5,000 such possibilities. But we have to identify which of them this couple is prone to have, do the procedure outside the body, and implant only the healthy fertilized eggs, and discard those that were found to be carrying the gene. By that way, we can prevent the birth of genetically significantly sick children without any halachic problem. Because halachically, the pre-implanted fertilized egg is not a human being. And because it is not a human being, it is not a form of an abortion. Which, by the way, is not the position of the Catholic Church. They hold that fertilization becomes a human being, no matter where. And therefore, discarding the fertilized egg that carries the gene is the same as aborting it. And since they don't allow abortion in any way, they don't allow to discard this fertilized egg. So therefore, they don't allow to do PGD at all. But halachically, we don't accept their position, and we don't regard the outside fertilized egg as a human being, and therefore, if we find it to be sick, to carry a sickness, we can discard it. And we can implant only the healthy ones. We have such a unit at Shaare Zedek where I work, and to date we did over 1,000 such cases of very significant genetic diseases with 0 mistakes. All children were born healthy. So that really is a major advancement of science that can help families to have healthy children. But once you know how to do it, you can do it at things that might be very problematic. For instance, you can choose the gender. Let's say someone has 2 boys and they want a nice little girl. So how do they make sure that the next pregnancy will be a girl? With PGD, it's very easy. You test for the X or Y chromosome, and you implant only what you want, XX or XY, and you have a baby boy or a baby girl. Is it permissible? Are you allowed to do the whole procedure of PGD to have a gender that you selected? Very problematic. It's not a medical issue, it's a social issue. Can we use it for social aspects? But even here, there are sometimes unique exemptions. There was a case in Israel of a couple that the husband was azoospermic. He didn't have any sperm. So for this couple to have a child, they needed a sperm donor. Halachically, a Jewish sperm donor is not permitted for various reasons. Again, I won't go into all the details. But a Gentile sperm donor, according to some of the poskim of the rabbis, is permissible. So this couple wanted a Gentile sperm donor. Now, the child that will be born to this couple will not belong to the husband. The husband is not the father. He has nothing to do with this child. He will raise it, but halachically he's not the father. Now it so happened that this husband was a Kohen. And if he is a Kohen, his son will not be a Kohen, because it's not his son, he's a Gentile sperm. Now imagine the father going up to bless the community as a Kohen, and his son can't do it. So everyone will shushka, well, something happened here, right? And they don't want to make it public knowledge. They want to keep it secret. So they wanted to do not only a sperm donation, but PGD to select a female. Because if you have a female, you can't detect that she belongs to a father or not, because Bat Kohen, a daughter of a Kohen, doesn't have any specific function. And it was allowed, and they did it. So that's sometimes a twist in the story where things can be permissible. Now, obviously, if we allow to do PGD, we intend to allow it for serious conditions. We're not doing it for nonsense things. But for instance, we can choose a baby that will have blue eyes. There are families that say, in our family, only blue eyes come into the family. We don't want anyone with a different color. So should we do a PGD for blue eyes, or for blonde hair, or for whatever? That's all genetically determined, and we can find the gene. So obviously, we don't allow it because it's really done for no good purpose. But sometimes the border, the dividing line between a serious disease and a non-serious disease, it's not so easily determined. And I'll tell you a story that we had to deal with. There is a gene for early balding in females, so that a female that is born with this gene will start balding in a very early age. And here comes this woman that has this gene and says, I want PGD so that my daughter will not be born with this gene and become balding at an early age. We thought that's not such a terrible situation, and we didn't allow it. So she said, you don't understand what it means. She started to become bald at the age of 4. And she said, imagine a little girl going to kindergarten, let's say even with a wig, it blows off, it comes off, the children are laughing at her. Then when it comes to shidduchim time, no one wants to go out with her because she doesn't look attractive enough, she's totally bald, she can't handle it. So after a lot of debate and crying, we decided to allow her because psychologically it's a huge burden on her. Medically speaking, it's not a major issue. You can live until 120 without hair. That's not something that kills anyone. But psychologically, it was a very touching situation, and we loved it. Then it so happens usually, if you get one unusual case, you get another one. Comes a Hasidic family that have a gene for early balding of male, not female. So here we said, what's the big deal? I also am a little balding, so what? So I'm still here, and I feel fine, and I don't see what the problem is. So they said again, you don't understand. Everyone in Cheder has long payas. When he will come to Cheder without payas, no one will believe that he's coming because he has a gene that no one heard about it. So they'll think that we don't rear him in the right way, and they won't accept it. So it may be a major issue in our society. So again, it's a situation where you have to weigh it per person and not just in a theoretical fashion. Another issue that comes up with PGD, which again, we had a few cases like that. Sometimes a child that is already in the world, 6, 7 years old, becomes sick with leukemia. And in order to save his life, he needs a bone marrow transplant. But the bone marrow has to match him. If it doesn't match him, it will be destroyed by the immune system of the recipient, of the child. Usually, either within the family or there are drives of people that volunteer to give samples, and you can find someone that matches this child and get the bone marrow from this person and save his life. But there are situations, luckily rare, but there are, that no one in the world matches this child. So this child is a good child by PGD that will be matching his future brother. And the child, once it's born, we can take the cord blood, which is like a bone marrow, implant it to the leukemic child and save his life. So what's the dilemma here? Because this couple decided they don't want any more children. This child is 6 years old, he is the youngest, and they already a long time decided they have enough, they have 15 children, they don't need anyone more. So in order to save his life, they have to do something they didn't plan. So they bring a child to the world that wasn't planned, wasn't wanted. But I don't think it's a major thing. Many children are born not planned and maybe not wanted, and yet they have a good life. And there's another human being in the world, certainly, that shouldn't be something that takes it away. But it has not yet been tested because this is all relatively new and the children are very young yet, those who became donors, who were created to become donors. But what happens if the child is born, we take the cord blood, we transplant to the leukemic child, and nevertheless he dies, which can happen. So this child was born in order to save his brother, and he couldn't do it. And here he is in the world, he came to the world in order to save the child, but he didn't do it. What psychological ramifications will it have on him, on his siblings, on his parents? We don't know. But we decided that because it is a real life-saving potential procedure, if the parents want it, there's really no reason to think that maybe something psychologically will be ever wrong, and we allowed it, and luckily it worked, and those two children were saved. So these are some of the ramifications of the new technologies. And finally, let me conclude with another aspect of modern genetics, which is still in a research stage, and that is curing a genetic disease. Up to now, we could use genetic markers to identify, we could prevent the birth of people with genetic defects, but once someone is born with a genetic defect, there's nothing that we can do today. But there is a research project that goes on now that can cut out the gene that is defective and replace it with the same gene that is healthy. So for instance, Tay-Sachs is a good example because it's a single gene mutation. One gene out of the 25,000 is defective. And this particular gene, which we know where it sits and how it looks and what it does, this causes the entire disease. Now, if we can cut it out and put the same gene as a healthy gene, we cure the child. He has no Tay-Sachs anymore because all is dependent on this one gene that is defective. So there are such, we call them scissors, biological scissors, called CRISPR. Maybe you read in the newspapers, there's a lot of talk about it. And this CRISPR knows how to cut, and it's not something that you can even see. I mean, it's very, very tiny. And if this will be perfected to a degree that we can use it, then we can cure diseases and not only prevent them. Currently, the problem is that many times it is called off-target, so that in order to cut exactly the defective gene, it goes off-target and cuts out a good gene and leaves the bad gene. So not only didn't we take out the bad gene, but we caused an additional disease because we took out a gene that is necessary. And that is very, very dangerous. So therefore, it's still in an experimental way, but hopefully, like many inventions, they'll find the right way how to be sure that they cut out the right area and replace it and treat. So what's the problem here? So some invoke a problem that is interfering in nature, in God, in a way that is unprecedented. We now do something with the genes that only God, who created us, knows how to do it. Are we allowed to interfere in such a level with the creation of God? And the answer from a Jewish point of view is that not only are we allowed, but in fact we might even be obligated to do it. Because we don't view it as playing God. That's a Christian concept. We don't play God in any way, because playing God means to do something from nothing. That is what God did. God created the world from nothing. We can't do it. We can't use nothing and make out of it something. No human being can do it. What do? We take something and we change it to something else. Something to something we do all the time. This building wasn't here when God created the world. We human beings decided that instead of standing out in the dark and in the cold and talking to you, it's nicer to talk to you when there are walls around. But we did it. We changed nature. Were we allowed to do it? Obviously. Why? Because we are partners with God in improving the world. There are a lot of proofs from the sources, and again I won't go into the details, but there are many proofs to show that the human intellect that God instilled in us is for us to use it intellectually and to make good use out of it. And the good use is, for instance, to cure a disease. And what's the difference between curing a pneumonia with antibiotics or saving the life of someone who's dying of heart failure and implanting him a new heart, or using the CRISPR and exchanging part of the genome? These are all parts of treatments which we are obligated to do in order to save our human fellow beings. And therefore, it is not even a beginning of a hesitation to say we are playing God. We are not playing God, we are partners with God, we have the intellect to do it which God gave us, and we have to use it in the right way. So that will be something that from our outlook will not be a problem as long as it works. If it doesn't work or it creates more damage than good, obviously we're not allowed to do it. But once we'll perfect it to a degree that it will be workable, then there will be no Jewish legal and theological problem in doing so. So there was a little bit of what genetics is doing today, and how we halachically either use it, or allow it, or don't allow it, depending on the circumstances where we want to apply it. Thank you.
I'm sure you've been asked this on a number of occasions. I was delighted to hear that where a mamzeret is concerned, you have a very compassionate manner of dealing with it. You weren't able to specify how. But can I ask why there cannot be endeavours to have a compassionate method of dealing with the aguna?
Well, we have a compassionate dealing with aguna in many instances. For instance, in order to prove something in Jewish law, you need two witnesses that are not related and have no interest in giving the witness in order to prove that it is or it isn't, right? That's how a legal system works. With aguna, we accept even one witness, and even someone who is related somehow, and perhaps is a little bit lying in order to help the aguna, and we accept it because we want to go as far as we can to help her. What we can't do is, if there's no evidence that the husband died, she's still a married woman. And if she's a married woman, her child will be a mamzer, and we want to avoid it. So maybe for her it's difficult, but it will be more difficult for the child. if he will turn out, if the husband will turn out and come back after a few years, and she remarried without divorce, and she has a child, this child is doomed. So you have to be careful on that side. You have to have compassion for the child, not only for her. So we do have compassion for the aguna. First of all, I mean those who are in charge of it, the dayanim, make tremendous efforts to get to the bottom to it and try to find whether indeed the husband died, and we can find some proof to it. We don't look for 100% proof. We don't look for the regular ways of proof. But some proof we have to have. Otherwise, she's still married.
Yes, but can she not, can it not be legislated that after a certain number of years, the husband is presumed dead?
How can you presume it? If he ran away, and he lives now a good life somewhere else, and all of a sudden he will appear after 20 years, it didn't make any difference. The child born will be a mamzer. To be careful, again, I'm saying you have to go on a very fine line between helping the woman on the one hand, but avoiding a mamzer on the other hand. You have to think about the children as well. So we do it. There are very few cases that are not solved, very few. There's another issue that is called aguna, but it's not, and that is when the husband refused to give it the get. That's a different issue. That's not an aguna. I mean, how can you force him to give the get? That's another issue. But a true aguna is someone that the husband disappeared, and we know nothing about him, nothing about his whereabouts. So for instance, after World War II, the assumption was that he really died, because most of the people who disappeared died. So there are hardly any agunot from World War II. But World War I was a different situation, because in World War I there was a static war. People used to be in trenches on both sides and just fire once and rest, and fire another time and rest, and that went on for years. That is not an assumption that he died. Not all of the people that died certainly weren't executed, weren't killed like in the Second World War. So the circumstances are important.
Yes.
You're talking about what I call genetic engineering. That, to me, I start hearing bells ringing of a master race. So should these techniques, obviously with Halacha, and we like to think that in civilized society there are checks and balances, but I don't know, it's just the idea of somebody producing a master race, if you can choose all the various good points.
Right. So what you are worried is called the slippery slope. That once you allow something which seems to be okay, that may lead to something that is a little less okay, but maybe still acceptable, and then you go from there to something which is even less acceptable until you come to something that everyone agrees it's unacceptable, but once you started the process, where do you stop it? Right? That's the issue.
No, the issue is, we would like to think that in civilized society it wouldn't happen, but in other societies which perhaps don't have the same
right.
standards.
So the idea is that once you have the technology, someone can use it or abuse it to something wrong. There is a concern. And in Halacha we do certain things which are not lenient, which are strict, because of the fear that it may lead to something which we don't want to get. So there have to be checks and balances, and sometimes even such checks that nullify the whole thing, that you're afraid that to begin with will be wrong. Okay? Now how do you weigh? When do you decide that I won't allow it at all because I'm afraid that either someone else or we ourselves with time will do something wrong? And when do we say, let's try it and hopefully no one will do anything? That's a matter of judgment. And as you say, Western society has become, in my view, quite responsible. Not everyone and not in every place, but it's quite responsible. On the other hand, all these technologies are very, very expensive. You can't do it privately in some dark lab and do something of this magnitude. It's impossible. So it's usually governmental funded and therefore governmental regulated, and things so far go well. It is true that if you're afraid of the slippery slope, then actually you shouldn't do anything. From everything can come a slippery slope. I always give the example that perhaps those who invented cars, if they would know what cars do today, the number of deaths, at least in Israel, from car accidents is greater than all the wars and terrorist attacks combined. So it's a terrible invention. So if you would have thought about it when you invented it, to say, yes, I can come to Burma quicker because I can drive by car or by train, but the price is hundreds of people dead because of this invention, maybe we should still go with horse and buggy. So you can't do it because you know that if you have good intentions and it makes sense and mostly it works well, you take into account that it might also go wrong. That's the nature of the beast. That's how life is.
I mean, you described the case of a woman who had extra hormonal treatment in order to produce these 15 eggs.
No, it's not the case. That's how it's done.
Yes, but you were describing it. My concern, we're talking about ethics, is by boosting the hormone levels in a woman, it can cause later in life all sorts of other problems. So how do you weigh that one thing up against the other?
Right. So in every IVF procedure, not for PGD, every regular IVF is done for an infertile couple. That, let's say, the regular way they can't have children. In order for them to have children, you have to do an in vitro fertilization. In every case of in vitro fertilization, you have to stimulate the woman to produce more eggs. Otherwise, there's no chance. From one egg, the chances of pregnancy are almost zero. So you do it all the time. Now you do it once. It's not someone that takes hormones all the time. It's just for the procedure. The risks there are risks, but they are very, very low. And the woman has to agree to take the risk. No one forces her. You want a child. You can't have it in any other way. You have to have the hormonal treatment for this particular cycle. Here and here are the risks. Are you willing to take it on? And in fact, again, if I'm coming to Israel, the risk of hormonal stimulation for IVF or PGD is 1,000% less than crossing the street in Israel. Oh. So, yet you cross the street all the time, right? You take this risk. Yeah.
I'd like to ask about organ donation as Halacha. I actually carry a donation card which I have written on it in accordance with Jewish law.
You what again? I didn't hear.
I carry an organ donation card which I have written on it in accordance with Jewish law. I have arranged with my doctor that I would like my cataracts to be used, but what else could be used? Because we all benefit sometimes from organs. What can a Jewish person donate?
Well, what he can certainly donate, if he can donate, I don't know when is your bedtime, but if we'll talk about it, you won't go to sleep tonight. It's a very long discussion, but let me just do it in a very brief way. Every organ that is life-saving is not only permitted, but is a mitzvah to donate, provided the person is dead when he donates, except for live donations, which we can discuss later. But we were discussing about organ donation with a card, which means after the death of the person, he wants parts of his body to be donated. So certainly those that are life-saving is a life-saving procedure. And a life-saving procedure by Jewish law overrules almost all prohibitions, including desecrating Shabbat, eating on Yom Kippur, eating chametz on Pesach in order to save life, life takes precedence. So although by donating an organ you violate several halachic prohibitions, for instance, you're not allowed to desecrate the body. Desecration of the body means to cut it, and you can't get out the heart or the liver without cutting, right? So that is a desecration. You're not allowed to benefit from the dead body. And obviously, if someone gets the heart or the lung, he benefits from it. He benefits from the dead body. And usually you're not allowed to have a benefit from the dead. You are supposed to bury every part of the body. And here, you're not burying several parts of the body. Yet all this is irrelevant because you are saving life. So in order to save life, you're allowed to desecrate the body, you're allowed to derive benefit, you're allowed not to bury those parts. That is okay. Where is the issue? The issue is that you can take it only from a dead person. But the question is, how do you define death? When is a person dead? That is a debatable issue. As was said earlier, the chief rabbinate ruled really in a landmark ruling that what we call in general brain death is the halachic moment of death. And therefore, those who accept this definition, obviously I was part of it, so I accept it, that the person who is diagnosed brain dead is dead, and therefore he can donate life-saving organs. But those who disagree and hold that brain death is not yet dead, because the heart is still functioning in this situation. And some say that a dead person is only after the heart stops. And as long as the heart didn't stop, he's still alive. And you can't take organs from a live person, because you're killing him. So according to this position, you cannot be an organ donor. But I think many, I won't count if most or not most, but many of the major halachic rulers hold that brain death is the halachic definition, and therefore you are right by carrying an organ donor card. The problem is, and that is a technical problem which is very important, even if we accept the principle of brain death, how do you do it practically? And the problem is that all over the world it is done in a way that we don't agree with it. It's not sufficient. And therefore we in Israel have enacted a law that regulates how to diagnose brain death that should fulfill the criteria of the person being dead. So if someone has an organ donor, he should make sure that whoever will take care of him after he's dead, I mean, if he's alive, he can't take care of it, right? And hopefully he'll be alive until 120, even though people will lose your organs by that age. But the person who is willing to be an organ donor has to make sure that someone who knows how to diagnose brain death will diagnose it correctly. And that is done in Israel by law now, and all over the world it has to be requested, because automatically it's not done. So that is something for you to know. Yes?
There's lots of items in the news about DNA being used to grow, say, ears or a nose or something like that and graft it onto people.
To do what?
They said they were growing ears.
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 Right. Well, it's not DNA, it's stem cells. That's a whole different story.
Right.
And again, if you want to be up until the morning, we can discuss stem cell. But in principle, stem cell is really the promise of the next decade. If that will work, then many of the degenerative diseases that we suffer nowadays might be cured. And again, here an interesting story. Halachically, you're allowed to use stem cells because they are derived from fertilized eggs. And you have to destroy the fertilized egg in order to obtain the stem cells. So again, without going into details, in general, halachically it's permissible. But the Catholics don't allow it. So they refuse to allow stem cell research, which is a major problem.
Thank you. I've read somewhere that the nearest to a human heart is a pig, and that in many cases transplants are taken, the heart is taken from a pig and put into a human. Where would we stand with that sort of...
Well, you're not correct enough. It's true that the pig immunologically is the closest to the human being. Hopefully not other characteristics of the pig, but immunologically you're right. And there's no problem at all to use a pig to save life. I mean, what's the issue? Moreover, what we are not allowed to do with a pig is to eat it. You don't implant the heart by eating it, right? So that will be a non-issue. But it doesn't work, so you don't have to be worried about it at the moment. Yes?
When my husband and I got married in Israel, we had to have a Tay-Sachs test. We were both Ashkenazi and we had a Tay-Sachs test in Israel.
Right.
Is that still the regular thing to be done today with young ones?
Well, in Israel, but now it's all over the world. I think even in England, there's a group called Dor Yesharim, and it's an interesting story. The founder of Dor Yesharim, Rabbi Eckstein, had 4 children with Tay-Sachs who died. And having this tragedy, he created this organization whereby youngsters, males and females, are tested for several, not only Tay-Sachs, several prevalent genes as carriers, which means a carrier is a person that he himself is healthy, but if he marries a carrier, together they have 25% to have a child that will be sick with the disease. So if I'm a carrier and I have a match, a woman that she also is a carrier, and if we get married, 25% of our children will have this disease. So by doing the Dor Yesharim process, you are tested and I am tested anonymously. You get a number and I get a number. And if we want to get married, we call in and we say, I'm number 55, you're number 213, and they will tell you if you are a match or not, based on the carrier state. But they are testing only 6 or 7 genes, which are frequent, but by now there are 5,000 diseases, so they really don't cover everything. And secondly, even if we are found to be non-matched by their description, and we get married, we still have the option of PGD, which now can avoid the birth of
What
Tay-Sachs.
about before marriage?
Oh, sorry, just want to finish.
No, before marriage, you cannot marry. If you know that both
No, what tests about the PGD or all the genetics tests before
No, you
marriage?
can't. You have to do it either on a fertilized egg or on a pregnancy, but you have to be married in order to fertilize the egg. I mean, you can do it if you want to do it in a free way, but from a Jewish point of view, you can't obtain sperm from a fellow and an egg from a female when they are not married.
So is that just Ashkenazi couples or even...
No, they have
and
different
Ashkenazi or
sets for
any-
non-Ashkenazi. Depending on the frequency of the genetic diseases in different communities, they have sets for them. They have set for Ashkenazi, for Moroccan, for Yemenite, and they are a
So
little
it's
bit different.
recommended really that any Jewish couple that are getting married do have the Tay-Sachs test?
Right,
Yes, I see. Thank you.
yes.
I'm a mediator, and recently a number of us were asked to mediate a certain kind of dispute, which is getting quite common now, where a hospital, the doctors of hospitals say this particular person, thinking of the patient coming first, has no chance of survival. We wish to stop life support. And yet the family members say because of they're a Muslim or they're Jewish, absolutely not. So some mediators, because our job is to come to with a compromise, are saying, okay, what's about before the hospital applies to the court order, which in this country is granted quite quickly, Before that happens, how about giving a period of time, a week, see if there are any developments, and can the agreement be, and the parties agree that after that 1 week, whatever, life support stop. Now, can I, as a mediator, as a Jew, facilitate some kind of compromise which could, well, shorten life?
So again, there are very few, but there are rabbis who rule that we have no say in life and death. Whatever we can do, we should do to prolong every minute of life, because the value of life is of infinite value, and whoever knows mathematics, infinity cannot be divided, cannot be subtracted, it goes forever, right? But that's a minority opinion. I don't think people know about it. The majority of the rabbis say that in case of suffering, there is no obligation to do something to prolong life. There is a prohibition to do something which will shorten life. But there is no obligation to do something which will prolong suffering if there is no chance. So for instance, someone who is going to die no matter what, within a few months, but is going to suffer these few months. And now he comes in a situation where he needs a respirator. You are allowed not to put him on a life support, and he will die quicker and not suffer, because you didn't do an act that shortened life. Whereas, if he's already on a respirator, you're not allowed to withdraw the respirator, because that is an act that shortens life. So that distinction is very clear, halachically accepted by all, and very different from the secular world. Because the secular world doesn't distinguish between omission and commission, which to me does make sense. I mean, there is an inherent distinction between omission. You didn't do anything. God took his life because you didn't intervene. Now, usually you intervene because you're an obligation to save life. But if this obligation is nullified because you can't save the life, so you're allowed to withhold the treatment. But if you do a commission, you take the respirator by hand out of the person and he dies, what's the difference between shooting him? Why not? And in fact, the Dutch and the Belgian, and now the Canadian, have enacted a law of active euthanasia, which means that a patient who is suffering and he's going to die within 6 months, 8 months, and he says, I want to die now, but there's nothing that will kill him now. What do? They take a gun and they shoot him. They don't do it because in hospitals we don't go with guns, but they take medication, they inject, and they kill him. Is something wrong with it? By their eyes, no. That's what the patient wants. And you're allowed to do commission like you're allowed to do omission, so why not? Yet most of the Western society did not accept it. Why? Why did they accept to pull the plug, which is an act that kills, but not to inject something which is an act that kills? What's the difference? So by halacha, there is a difference. You're not allowed to do an act that kills the patient. You are allowed in certain circumstances not to intervene and let the person die, like it was 100 years ago when there were respirators. The patient dies. And there are sources in the Talmud already discussing this difference and allowing it. Now, as I said, there are some rabbis, a very small minority, that says, who are we to decide who will live and who will die? It's not in our hands. Whatever we can do, we should do. But the majority does not agree. So the compromise is to withhold, but not to withdraw. That is one distinction. And another important distinction, which, again, there is a big dispute between our point of view and the secular point of view, is matters that keep a person alive but are unrelated to the cause of death. For instance, if someone is dying of suffocation, So you can prolong his life by putting him on a respirator, and you can avoid putting him on a respirator because this is the cause that he's going to die. So for this cause, if you're allowed not to intervene, you didn't intervene. But again, the secular world took it one step further and said, food and fluid, why should we give him? He is going to die anyway from cancer, but he will die in 6 months. Let's starve him to death and he will die in 2 weeks. And that's done all the time in the secular world. They start food and fluid. That halachically is absolutely not permissible. Even we, if we will starve, will die. So the fact that he's going to die from a different reason, why should you kill him by starvation and dehydration? So that you're not allowed to do. So there are a lot of, they are just examples, there are the whole host of situations where some are allowed and some are not.
Thank you.
I'm interested in where you draw the line, a bit along the lines that Jonathan was asking before. But when you were talking about PGD, you indicated that clearly it would be okay to screen before cells are going to be implanted for Tay-Sachs disease, but not for blue eyes or brown eyes.
Right.
But then when you were talking about the, I think is it forthcoming technology that might allow us to change a gene in an already living person, you were saying you could change the Tay-Sachs gene mutation for a healthy gene, and you were likening that to using other technology to cure disease or to provide us with shelter. So does it work in the other way? Because you could use technology, say cosmetic surgery, to make someone's nose larger or smaller or any other body part. So would it be all right to use a gene, if it was possible, to replace a gene that gave someone a larger or smaller nose? And if so, could you give someone better eyesight? And what about something you couldn't do by technology, like making someone taller or shorter?
Right. So I think the dividing rule, the simplest dividing rule, although there are never very sharp dividing rules ever, that's human nature. But it is between disease and non-disease. So blue eyes is not a disease. You can do it, but it's not a disease. Tay-Sachs is a disease. Curing Tay-Sachs is curing a disease. Making the nose larger or smaller is not a disease. Now, plastic surgery, by the way, halachically is not allowed. You're not allowed to take a risk for no good reason. And just to make the nose a little smaller is not a good reason enough to take the risk. Unless that really disturbs you either practically or emotionally. So that becomes a disease. It becomes a psychological disease. So let's say because you have a huge nose and you can't marry because of it, or you have a huge ears and no one wants to take you into a job, so you're losing out. That may become a valid reason. But just because you feel that with a little smaller nose you'll feel a little better, it's not allowed. The same way as blue eyes with PGD. It's the same.
Poor eyesight.
Poor eyesight depends on how poor it is. If you don't see 6/6, it's not really a good reason to go into a risk. But if you see 660 and you need eyeglasses that you hardly can wear them on your nose, then if you can correct it, why not? It's a disease. Yes.
I was going to say, where do you draw the line? It's a similar question to what's been asked, but where do you draw the line between the quality of life?
Between
the quality of life of someone who has some genetic defect. We happen to have children who have a genetic defect that we didn't know anything about. And I'm just looking at them. They have a very good quality of life. They might not be like you or me, but they're very happy. Right. They have a good quality of life. So who's to say that they should never be brought into this world? It so happened we didn't know anything about it, but do you see what I mean? So when you're talking about diseases that you test for, Tay-Sachs, I appreciate that the children die at a very young age, but where do you draw the line?
Right.
And also, who's to say what is normal and what is not normal?
Right.
If you don't have people who are different to what should I say, a person who you think is normal, then you've got nothing to judge by. I mean, it
Right.
puts a different perception on life altogether.
Right.
You see what I mean? Are you trying to bring into the world people who are all the same and have the same intellectual ability? Who's to say what is quality of life?
Right. So, for instance, we don't allow PGD for Down syndrome because Down syndrome children, if they're healthy, they don't have diseases. But if they are healthy, they themselves are very happy children. They feel themselves very well. It's we that look on them.
Exactly. Well, I was going to say, I mean, I know a lot of Down, and you know, this is the thing, they are happier than
Right.
a lot of people.
Right, absolutely. So we don't do it really for that reason. Just because society thinks that they are different, that is not enough of a reason not to bring them to the world. That's absolutely true. I'll give you even an opposite example. The Deaf Society are looking to do PGD to have a child with deafness. Because they think that their life is better than your life here. Can you accept this? Well, so here's where do you draw the line? I mean, they look to do PGD, there's a gene that causes deafness, and they look for this gene, and they want this child, another child without the deafness.
Particularly after the Oscar-winning movie about a deaf child, that will probably increase them.
Yeah, I mean, we don't allow it because we think that really the quality of life of a deaf person is poorer than someone who hears because of circumstances. It doesn't mean that once he's deaf, we have to kill him because there's no quality of life. But to create someone as a deaf person, we don't allow it. But there are clinics that do it for their request. So it's really a difficult situation. It's a judgmental situation. Like many of our decisions, there's no black and white.
Professor, Rabbi, you mentioned that there is a particular gene which is in every Jewish person. Can you tell us what this gene does?
No, it's not a gene. It is a mutation within the gene. The whole gene is a normal gene that works perfectly well.
Do we know
but there are we know only about 5% of our genomic makeup, what it does. All the rest, we don't know why it's there and what it does.
Okay.
So there may be mutations. Each of us has hundreds of mutations. We don't know about it. But it not necessarily comes back in a certain community, and certainly doesn't come only from the mother. So the uniqueness of the Jewish gene is that it is different than other populations. It comes from the mother, but it doesn't affect the life at all. Just a marker.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to ask if identified twins have the same DNA, exactly.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah, if they're identical. Not all twins are identical.
Yes.
But identical twins have the same.
Same.
Yeah, they have the same genetic makeup. Yes.
Can you explain to me, please? I know it's not a Jewish question, but identical twins who look slightly different. What has happened? Is it something in the womb that's happened, or
some mutations? Everyone can have. I mean, the basic is the same because they were divided at a very early age. But some of them may have some mutations that cause them to be a little different. Okay, maybe last question?
Okay, I'll try and make it short. I want to look at the bigger picture. I want to ask you about consequences and safeguards, following on from Jonathan's question, which I'm sure was in all our minds, and your answer of the car. When eugenics was first invented, it was thought it was a good thing. Likewise with the internet, and we're now moving into the darker side of it. So what can you see as consequences of this? And what safeguards would you be keen to see? Would you like there to be a global agreement that Jewish law could sign up to?
Yes, so I don't know what consequences I can foresee because it's unexpected. If we would know, we would certainly prevent it. There may be things that we don't know. But what the world, at least the Western world, is doing now is every new invention has to go through an ethics committee, which is independent of the scientists, and they look into it and try to decide whether the benefit outweighs the damage or not. We are sure that there's nothing that is all good and no bad at all. As it is almost nothing that is all bad and nothing good. But certainly if it's a lot of bad and little good, we don't want it to happen altogether. So there are a lot of ethics committees, national and institutional, and they look into every research and they try to decide which one is legitimate and which one is not. Once it's decided to be legitimate and it goes out, then not always can we control it. But so far, it goes quite well. No catastrophes have happened with a decade of such enormous inventions, and still we exist and everything is fine.
Thank you.
Okay, last question.
Going back to the example you gave of curing diseases, there's a view in Judaism that Hashem puts a human being, a Jew, in the world to achieve certain things. And if they're born with an illness, then that is part of what they've got to achieve. And if you take that illness away from them, you're stopping them achieve what Hashem put them down to achieve in this reincarnation.
So that's against the Rashi in Bava Kama. You accept Rashi? So I'll tell you briefly. It says, V'rapo yerapeh, that if someone has damaged a fellow man, he has to pay 5 types of damages. One of them is the medical treatment. If I hit someone and he is injured, breaks him, and the one that hit him has to pay for it. Says the Gemara, Mikan shenitna reshut harofeh lerapeh. That is a sign that a physician is allowed to treat a patient, because otherwise, why should you pay? If I injured someone and he went to a doctor and the doctor cured him and took money, if he wasn't allowed to cure him, why should I pay? So the fact that I'm obligated to pay means, that's the Gemara, that there is a permission to a doctor to treat.
But that is a
1 minute. Says Rashi, why do you need a permission? Why would you think differently? Do we find a permission that a carpenter can make a table? Do you find a permission that an engineer will build a building? Why does a doctor need a permission to be a doctor? Says Rashi, because we could have thought that if HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted him to be sick, or wanted him to be injured, who are you, the human being, that goes against HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How can you cure him? Says the Gemara, yes, you're not only allowed to cure him, you must cure him. Why? Because we don't go into the cheshbonos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We don't go into his calculation. We don't know it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us an intellect, and he told us how to treat. That is coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Nothing comes by chance, as we believe. So if I know how to treat, according to Rashi, that is what the Torah tells us that I must treat. And that's the din in Shulchan Aruch.
But that is talking about a case where the person became ill.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Any illness, no matter where it comes from, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if he wants it to be, it will be, even if I am the best doctor, I'll fail. That's clear. There's Hashgacha Pratis, right? There's a providence. HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided what to be. I can't make these calculations. I have my obligation. I have to do the best I know. Sometimes I fail. You know, the joke about physician is that if the physician succeeded, then everyone blesses HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Baruch Hashem, he became healthy. If the physician failed, what a bad physician. That is how we are looked at. Okay, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rabbi Dr. Steinberg.
think what we've witnessed here tonight was a rare, phenomenal combination of Torah, medicine, and science. Besides the eloquence and the depth and the scope of this brief talk that we had tonight, we've also seen an illustration of the eternity of the Torah. Contrary to public myth in this contemporary day and age, that you can't be a rabbi and a scientist, or Torah's principles are outdated. They were good for the time of Moses, but nowadays we have science and all the advances in technology and in scientific knowledge. Much of the Torah doesn't even make sense because we could contradict it with science. Here we've seen very briefly an illustration how the truth is quite the contrary. Science only complements the Torah, and Torah only complements science. The more genuine a scientist is, and the greater a doctor is, the more he will see how the truth of science and the truth of medicine is maintained only through the Torah. And we see it in today's day and age when you have so many doctors and so many scientists who could show us, like the way Rabbi Steinberg has shown us tonight, how the Torah's messages relate to such contemporary cases, and how through the knowledge of Torah as a rabbi, of the caliber that he is, that he's able to find solutions and the answers and the correct approach, that we could be guided how to make every step, even in medicine and in the field of science, through the light of the Torah. So Yasher Koyach, and